Questions without notice. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is addressed to the Prime Minister. Is the Prime Minister comfortable with the government's decision to both permit Mr Rahim Kassam to enter Australia and allow government members to share a public platform with him, when Mr Kassam has made many extreme comments, including remarks about the Scottish First Minister that I'm certain he would agree are both misogynistic and completely unacceptable?
The Minister for Immigration.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. In relation to the question, of course, all applications to enter Australia are dealt with under the provisions of the Migration Act, and all non-citizens must meet the character test. Now, of course, for people who may hold controversial views, any impact of those views must always be balanced against Australia's well-established principles of freedom of speech. But I won't be making any comments about specific applications or cases.
The Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
Yes, Mr Speaker. On the point of order, the question also went to whether the Prime Minister is comfortable with government members sharing a platform with this bloke.
The Leader of the Opposition will resume his seat. The Leader of the Opposition will resume his seat. Just again, for the information of those asking questions, the practice makes it very clear the Prime Minister can refer any question to any minister. The member for Moncrieff.
My question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister inform the House how the Morrison government is demonstrating it's on the side of Australians by backing the choices they are making for themselves and their family, their communities and their future?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you. I thank the member for Moncrieff for her question, and I congratulate her on her first main speech in this parliament, Mr Speaker, and the experience and the life experience and the skills that she has, and how this will make an enormous contribution in this place, and I congratulate her. Mr Speaker, the Australian people made a choice that they want a government that believes in lower taxes, not higher taxes. They made a choice that they wanted to be able to keep more of what they earn. That's the choice, and not just as individual taxpayers going to work every day, but small businesses going and doing the hard slog and taking risks and putting in businesses. They wanted and made a choice that they wanted a government who believes that taxes should be lower, not higher, Mr Speaker. They made a choice that they wanted a government that knew how to put the conditions in place to create more jobs. And after more than 1.3 million jobs being created in the first two terms of this government, Mr Speaker, they chose to see another 1.25 million jobs created over the next 5 years. They chose that a surplus is what this government needed when it comes to responsible financial management, and they chose responsible economic and financial managers who knew how to deliver surpluses, and we are now in the first year of surplus in 12 years, Mr Speaker. They chose to have the services, the essential services that they rely on, affordable medicines, 2,000 of them listed on the PBS, record funding for hospitals and schools. They chose to have those essential services guaranteed, not by higher taxes, but a stronger economy and a government who understood that. Mr Speaker, they chose that they wanted Australians to be kept safe and that they wanted their borders to remain secure. That's what they chose. They chose that they wanted Australians to get home sooner and safer. They chose that they wanted to enable their kids to be able to buy a house, and that the house that they owned would not be eroded by the reckless policies of the Labor Party. They chose practical policies, realistic policies that reduce our emissions and take action on climate change without destroying the livelihoods of Australians all across this country, with reckless schemes that the Labor Party could not even answer a question about what their impact would be on Australians' daily lives, their jobs, their economy and the cost to them. They chose to decide that they would make the consideration about what industries would be in their communities, and they wouldn't have people coming up in caravans from the south, parading around North Queensland and other places, telling them what jobs they could have and make them feel guilty about the industries that they have always depended on and will continue to depend on. Mr Speaker, they chose a government that knows how to keep the lights on and reduce power prices.
Has concluded. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is addressed to the Prime Minister and it follows my previous question. Is the Prime Minister comfortable with members of his government sharing a platform at a conference with Mr Matt Gates, who invited a Holocaust denier to the 2018 State of the Union address by the President of the United States?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker.
Members on my right. Members on my right. The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank the member for his question and I concur with the statements made by the Leader of the Government in the Senate in relation to that matter, which I'm happy to table.
The member for Isaacs. Members on my left. The member for Sydney. The member for Mallee has the call.
My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Infrastructure, Transport and Regional Development. Will the Deputy Prime Minister update the House on how the Morrison and McCormack government is on the side of Australians who choose to live and work in rural and regional Australia?
Members on my left. The Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and thank you to the member for Mallee for her question. Thank you for her first question in this House, first of many, and what an outstanding inaugural speech she made earlier, in which she set out the plan for the Liberals and Nationals, particularly for regional Australia, and also had some of her own visions and ideas that will make regional Australia a better place in which to live, work and invest. Mr Speaker, the member for Mallee has an outstanding public record of supporting her local community. She was the founder, the former director and the patron of Mildura-based Zoe Support, a not-for-profit organisation providing pre-birth support for young women and connecting them post-birth through social and educational programs, getting them back into the workforce, building a better future for them. She's been a champion of women, the member for Mallee, and she's going to be a champion for the people of Mallee. The government is delivering on its vision for regional Australia. We're establishing a House of Representatives Select Committee that will examine the future needs of the regions. It will bring together the stories, the vast stories, the experience of how regional economies are diversifying, how regional industries are finding their way and how regional communities are boosting their resilience, their hope and working together collaboratively, cooperatively to secure their future, because when the regions are strong, so too is our nation. The member for Lyons says that all the time, Mr Speaker, and he's right. The new committee will be chaired by the member for Barker, who, like all the rest of us on this side of the House, want to see our regional communities continue to flow and flourish. And I'm sure the member for Hunter, he can participate on that committee if he's so selected, Mr Speaker. The good people of Mallee know their member has come to this place to advocate for them and for their needs. And whether it's the $60 million Swan Hill Bridge, the $2.5 million Kahuna Airport upgrade or $1.5 million upgrade of the Horsham Livestock Exchange, we're backing, the member for Mallee's backing those fine Victorians. Mr Speaker, the significance of our investment in regional Australia was best summed up by Mayor of Mildura Simon Clements when I announced a $2 million instrument landing system for the Mildura Airport. Now, in the scheme of a $100 billion infrastructure investment in our nation, $2 million mightn't sound that much, but he said that it was probably the biggest investment in Mildura's future there ever has been. Now, this investment will support an estimated 600 international flight students and inject up to $90 million worth of economic activity into the local economy. And already there's been the expressions of interest from 6 potential flight schools, 6 potential pilot academies coming to Mildura, boosting the economy and boosting the surrounding towns as well. Now, since we've come to government in 2013, we've committed almost $33 billion to economic and social infrastructure programs that specifically benefit rural and regional Australia. Rural and regional Australians can certainly depend on the Liberals and Nationals we have their back.
Concluded. The member for Hindmarsh.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Emissions Reduction. Does the minister agree with the member for Longman that children should be taught that climate change is not real?
Members on my right. Members on my right. The member for Brisbane. The minister has the call.
That was a fabulous speech.
Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And we heard from the member for Longman a fabulous first speech this week, Mr Speaker. Now, climate change is real and we are taking practical action to deliver emissions reduction. We know we are on track to meet our 2030 targets. The Climate Solutions Package is doing exactly that for us, Mr Speaker. $3.5 billion committed to ensure that we will achieve our 2030 targets exactly as we achieved our 2012 Kyoto targets and our 2020 Kyoto targets as well. But we will do that, Mr Speaker, whilst maintaining a strong economy, in contrast to those opposite.
I call the member for Indi.
My question is to the Minister representing the Minister for Families and Social Services. The New Start allowance paid to more than 4,400 people in Indi is indexed to the CPI, with inflation now 1.6%. Since 2000, the cost of essential goods and services has increased far greater than CPI. I, like many in this place, including a growing number from those on the government side, support an increase to the New Start allowance. When will the government increase the New Start allowance, and will the government consider using a fairer index for future payments that better reflects the cost of essential goods and services?
The Minister for Social Services has the call.
Well, I do thank the member for Indi for her question, and I congratulate her on completing her first speech. The government has a very clear and consistent position when it comes to New Start. The purpose of New Start is to assist people to get into or to return to the workforce. And our focus is on helping people move from welfare into work. The best form of welfare is a job. And of course, we are very focused on generating an increase in jobs. And indeed, since we came to government in 2013, we've generated more than 1.3 million new jobs. As at June 2018, Mr Speaker, there were 230,000 fewer Australians of working age on income support payments than in June 2014. The proportion of Australians of working age on income support payments has fallen to its lowest level in 30 years at 14.3%. Every Australian who moves from welfare into work achieves a personal victory. They achieve a victory in terms of a sense of contribution and self-esteem and, of course, an improvement in their financial position. So what we are determined to do is to support Australians on New Start in making that transition from welfare to work. We're doing that by driving growth in the economy and generating jobs, and we are doing it also with targeted assistance to people who are on welfare through schemes like PATH, the Youth Jobs PATH program, Prepare, Trial and Hire. We're spending almost $800 million over 4 years.
The Minister will just resume his seat. The member for Indi on a point of order.
Relevance, Mr Speaker. I asked about in relation to the rate of CPI.
Yes, and I just point out to the member for Indi, as I've pointed out to crossbenchers previously, that certainly was part of the question. It was one question, but there was also a lot of many other statements in there that, if it didn't take up the full 45 seconds, took up nearly all of it. And for that reason, the minister is in order. In other words, it wasn't the only thing she spoke about. The minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. So the PATH program is one of a number of targeted ways in which we are assisting and supporting Australians to move from welfare into work. Nearly $800 million committed to that over 4 years, and to date some 47,000 or 63% of participants have succeeded in getting a job. Of course, the Parents Next program is another program targeted at people who are moving into the workforce, in this case parents who are out of the labour force, helping them to build work readiness. $356 million committed to that program. So, Mr Speaker, our government is determined to assist people make the transition from welfare to work. There is more to do, but very significant progress being made.
The member for Higgins.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. Will the Treasurer outline to the House how the Morrison government is on the side of Australians who quietly chose sound budget management as a key priority for Australia's future? Is the Treasurer aware of any alternate policies?
Just before I call the Treasurer, I haven't called the Treasurer. He's, as I said, he's on mute. I just the member for Chifley is always about this time in question time. He's warned, and I didn't see, but I recognise the voice of the member for Spence. So if you can cease interjecting, the Treasurer has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Higgins for her question. And she brings to this place an enormous amount of experience in the medical research field and as a leading paediatrician, and she'll be a fantastic representative for Higgins, Mr Speaker. Now, the member for Higgins knows, and we on this side of the House know, that we are backing Australians who want a stronger economy, backing Australians who chose at the last election responsible financial management and lower taxes, Mr Speaker. And we have an economy which is in its 28th consecutive year of economic growth, a AAA credit rating from the 3 leading credit rating agencies. More than 1.4 million new jobs have been created on our watch, and a budget that is coming back into surplus, Mr Speaker. A budget that is coming back to surplus because we have a record number of Australians in a job, and because the proportion of working-age Australians on welfare is at the lowest level in 30 years, and because we have targeted spending, Mr Speaker. Now, we know that when we came to government, we inherited $240 billion of accumulated deficits from those opposite, Mr Speaker. And instead of missing their final budget outcomes, Mr Speaker, in 2016-17, we delivered a final budget outcome that was $4 billion better, around $4 billion better than forecast. And in 17-18, it was around $20 billion that was better than forecast. And in 18-19, I'm confident that we will also outperform our budget forecast, Mr Speaker. But I'm asked, are there any alternative approaches? Well, we know that those opposite talk down the Australian economy, Mr Speaker. And we know that just months ago they took to the Australian people a plan for $387 billion of higher taxes, Mr Speaker. And we know that when they were last in government, they announced invisible surpluses that were never delivered, Mr Speaker. And who did that, Mr Speaker? Well, Euro Money Treasurer of the Year, the former member for Lilly, did that, Mr Speaker. And the former member for Lilly with his carbon tax and his mining tax, Mr Speaker. But maybe we were too harsh. Maybe we were too harsh on the former member for Lilly. Because you know who was his chief of staff? You know who was pulling the strings? Set tax along, Mr Speaker!
The Treasurer will resume his seat. Treasurer will resume his seat. Member for Moreton. Just going to say to the Treasurer, I know he's used that term a couple of times, and the fault for that lies with me. We're not going to return to unparliamentary language or not referring to members by their correct titles. Members on my right, and just members on my right, I think the Treasurer wants to get back to his answer when he can, and he needs to withdraw, and I'm not going to allow that situation to continue. And government ministers certainly won't like it if there's return fire, if I can put it that way. The Treasurer for 29. Yeah, it's okay. We've got the clock. 29 seconds. Yep.
Well, okay, Mr. Speaker, I withdraw, but I make the point that the member for Rankin was the co-architect of $387 billion of higher taxes. There he was, with the silent member for McMahon, a retirees tax, a superannuation tax, new taxes on family businesses and new taxes on hard-working Australians, Mr. Speaker. We know on this side of the House we always stand for lower taxes.
The member for Whitlam.
Declining living standards.
The member for Whitlam has the call.
Speaker, my question is to the Minister for Energy and Emissions Reduction. Minister, why did he register Eastern Australia irrigation in the Cayman Islands?
That question's out of order. I think that question is out of order. The member for Stirling.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And my question is to the Treasurer. Will the Treasurer update the House on how the Morrison government is on the side of Australians who choose lower taxes and keeping more of what they earn as critical to their future? Aware of any alternative higher taxing policies?
I call the Treasurer.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for Stirling and congratulate him on an outstanding first speech. And he comes to this place having represented Australia on the battlefield with distinction, Mr. Speaker. And he has a great passion for small business, and I had the opportunity to visit with him in the electorate of Stirling and talk to small businesses. And we know that around 20,000 small businesses in the electorate of Stirling will be able to access the extended instant asset write-off for businesses with a turnover of up to $50 million, Mr. Speaker, and it's been extended in the budget to $30,000, Mr. Speaker. And around 70,000 taxpayers in the electorate of Stirling will be getting a tax cut as a result of a tax package that we on this side of the parliament passed through the House, Mr. Speaker. And around 70,000 people in Stirling will be the beneficiaries. And I can inform the House that 4.5 million Australians have put in their tax forms for the 18-19 year, Mr. Speaker, and the Australian Tax Office has provided over $6 billion worth of refunds. Now, that's money that is spent at local cafes and local shopping strips with local tradies, Mr. Speaker. Now, the Australian people were given a clear choice at the last election. They could have voted for those opposite with $387 billion of high taxes, but they rejected it, Mr. Speaker, and they voted in favour of a coalition government, the Morrison government, that is in support of lower taxes for millions of Australians, Mr. Speaker. And we're abolishing a whole tax bracket. We're lifting the threshold of the 19 cents in the dollar tax bracket, and we're lowering the rate, creating one major tax bracket between $45,000 and $200,000, where the rate will be 30 cents in the dollar, Mr. Speaker. And that is where the bulk of Australian taxpayers will be, and it will tackle bracket creep, Mr. Speaker. So if you get another job, or you get a promotion, or you do some overtime, Mr. Speaker, you won't necessarily pay a higher marginal rate of tax. And it goes back to the values that we stand for on this side of the House. We want Australians to earn more
and to keep more of what they earn, Mr Speaker. We believe in the aspiration of hard-working Australians, a term that mystifies the member for Sydney, Mr Speaker. We understand aspiration and we are delivering benefits to those Australians who have aspiration, Mr Speaker. And it was a very clear choice at the last election. The Australian people could have voted for the superannuation tax put forward by the Labor Party, the retirees tax, the housing tax, the tax on family businesses, the tax on hard-working Australians, or they could have voted for tax cuts. They voted for our tax cuts, and now we're delivering them.
The Treasurer's time has concluded. The member for Griffith.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Energy and Emissions Reduction. I refer to his previous answers. Did the minister or any of his associated entities or indirect interests receive any payments, income or benefit from the $80 million water buyback from Eastern Australian agriculture?
Yes, the Leader of the House. Members on my right. Members on my right.
Mr Speaker, understanding.
I haven't called you yet. I'm trying to persuade some people to stop interjecting before I eject them. The Leader of the House.
Well, Mr Speaker, the question goes to matters that the minister is not responsible or officially connected with as a matter of public affairs administration or pending proceedings.
The Manager of Opposition Business.
Mr Speaker, to the point of order, the Leader of the House is correct if we were relying on that, but we're not. We're relying on the previous answers that the minister has given, where he has referred to his different interests, where he has referred to associated entities, and that's what the question draws on.
Yes, and I'm going to take the House back to when we've been in this situation before, and I'm just going to reaffirm an earlier ruling I made, and I did listen to the question very closely. I had a problem with it instantly, I have to say, and I think if we go back to when we had a series of these questions which occurred a couple of years ago, and the member for Isaacs was asking a lot of them. I allowed a number of them where a connection is made, but what I also said was that did not then open it up to simply just say I refer you to your previous answers and ask a question not related to the minister's responsibilities, and except somehow it connects together, and that question falls in that category, and I'm ruling it out of order. The member for Lindsay.
My question is to the Minister for Housing and Assistant Treasurer. Will the minister update the House on how the Morrison government is on the side of Australians who choose to buy their own home? Is the minister aware of any alternative policies?
The Minister for Housing and the Assistant Treasurer.
Good minister.
Well, thanks very much, Mr Speaker, and can I thank the member for Lindsay for her question, who, before being in this place, has a great history of experience in the housing sector. And can I say to the member for Lindsay and indeed the whole House that the Morrison government's supporting hard-working Australians trying to get into a new home. We've already passed the First Home Super Saver scheme, which has helped 3,500 first-home buyers get into the market, a policy opposed by those opposite. We're working on the First Home Loan Deposit Scheme, which will start on the 1st of January next year and which will allow first-home buyers to purchase a property with a 5% deposit supported by the government. We've also set up the National Housing Finance Investment Corporation, which has already assisted with 560 new affordable homes throughout Australia. We've also encouraged and indeed removed the impediments for older Australians looking to downsize, freeing up more housing for the next generation. And that's why, Mr Speaker, we've seen so much confidence flow back into the housing market since the election of the Morrison government. And, Mr Speaker, I'm asked by the member for Lindsay about alternative policies, and surprise, surprise, there are some alternative policies that are relevant here. And indeed, I note that today a report was released by Deloitte Access Economics analysing the impacts of Labor's housing taxes, abolishing negative gearing and doubling capital gains tax. The House would be interested to know the House will be interested to know that in this report, the report found construction of new housing would fall, 7,800 construction jobs would be lost, rents would increase, construction activity would reduce by $766 million, and GDP would be hit by $1.5 billion. So it's no surprise, Mr Speaker, that the disastrous housing taxes have mysteriously disappeared from the ALP website. We've got the co-architect of the housing taxes, the member for Rankin, along with the member for McMahon and along for the member for Maribyrnong, left sort of carrying the baby. I'd say to the opposition leader, stand up to the member for Rankin and decide whose side are you on. Are you on the side of the 42,000 nurses who have invested in property? Are you on the side of the 1.2 million people and the 1.2 million Australian workers in the building industry? Are you on the side of potential first-home buyers? Because from Canning to Chisholm, from Leichhardt to Lindsay, we are backing hard-working Australians to get into the housing market.
The member for Griffith.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Energy and Emissions Reduction. I refer to the minister's previous answers and his statement in this House that he has disclosed interests in accordance with the rules.
Sorry, the member for Griffith, just pause for a second. There's a couple of people interjecting, but I'm finding it difficult to hear the member for Griffith, which is rather ironical because I always hear her interjections, but I'm just trying to hear the question. I'll ask the minister, the member for Griffith, to start again, if that's okay.
Thanks,
start
Mr.
again. The
Speaker.
clock will start again.
My question is to the Minister for Energy and Emissions Reduction. I refer to the minister's previous answers and his statement in this House that he has disclosed interests in accordance with the rules. Does he stand by that statement, and has he disclosed any income or other benefit derived from consultancy fees to Eastern Australian Agriculture or Eastern Australia Irrigation or any of their associated entities?
The Leader of the House.
I mean, at least, Mr Speaker—
The Leader of the House has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. At least the second part of that question violates the same Order 98C that we've just spoken to. The fact that the minister on a previous answer said that he'd disclosed interest in accordance with the rules is not a linkage in to ask him about any matter outside of his portfolio.
The Leader of the House. I'll hear from—
He gave himself up.
No, the Leader of the Opposition. I'm patiently listening to the Leader of the House and the Manager of Opposition Business.
Mr Speaker, in following on from the earlier ruling that you gave where you specified that the connection should be made, this question refers to the previous answer, refers specifically to what the statement made was in the previous answer, and then specifically tests whether or not that was true.
Yeah, well, I have a different difficulty with the question, I suppose, and we're just sort of going over the same ground we did the last time this occurred. I agree with the Leader of the House that the second part of the question is out of order. The first part of the question, I believe, is in order, but I'm saying now the minister can direct himself to the first part of the question. I'm saying it's going to be very difficult, given the nature of that, what that now becomes, for there to be too many complaints about how he addresses it. I'm just saying that up front. But I'm also flagging, if questions are asked that have one section that is clearly out of order, I'm not going to allow that mechanism to occur in the question, and I've warned on that before. So on this occasion, I'll just say to the minister the first part of the question was in order, and he just can ignore the second part of the question.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. All my interests are declared in accordance with the rules.
The member for Goldstein.
My question is to the Minister for Industrial Relations. Will the minister please advise the House on how the Morrison government is backing Australian workers who choose better protection of their entitlements above lining the pockets of unions and employer associations? And is the minister aware of any other approaches on this important issue?
The Minister for Industrial Relations.
Mr Speaker, I thank the member for his question. And of course we are a government on the side of those Australians who have money in workers' benefit funds and want to see that money properly spent on workers' benefits and properly accounted for. And why do we need this transparency? Well, yesterday we found out that the Protect Workers' Benefit Fund had transferred in 2 years $45 million to the ETU, $10.4 million of which went to NECA, an employer organisation. The bill before the House would simply require proper accounting for what goes into the benefit funds, what comes out and how it's spent, so that we can all actually know that it is spent to the benefit of workers. Now, the Shadow Minister's position is stated this way. He says, quote, "I don't think it's legitimate to say that we need more scrutiny over the jointly managed funds where all the money has been going to specific programs that workers benefit from." But that is the question, isn't it? Is all the money going to specific programs that workers benefit from? And we have a yes from members opposite. Well, what about the $10.4 million that went to NECA just to improve their bottom line? How did that benefit workers? $10.4 million. How much money is enough before you start wanting transparency? 45 million, 100 million? How about 125 million? Because when you reverse engineer and look at the money going into the ETU, how much money has gone into the ETU over the last 10 years? $125 million. From sources that it is just impossible to determine. A huge amount of that money is clearly from workers' benefit funds. And let's look at the specific programs that apparently workers are benefiting from. Management fees to the ETU, a total of $27 million. $27 million in management fees. Admin income, $26 million. Trust distributions, a paltry $67 million. And how about, just for good measure, directors' fees and interest, $5 million. So last week the Shadow Minister said he was very alarmed at all of this. Now the Shadow Minister is, quote, entirely comfortable with what the ETU has done. Now, Mr Speaker, instead of Darwin, if he had uncovered the survival of the most comfortable rather than the survival of the fittest, these people would rule the earth. They have survived the most easily comfortable people, the most easily assured people of all time. $125 million has gone to the ETU with no proper accounting whatsoever for what that money is being spent on. What we want to see is proper accounting that says that that money is being spent on domestic violence programs or postnatal repression programs or funeral services or gambling assistance. What we don't want to see is $5 million on directors' fees.
Concluded. The member for Hindmarsh.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Energy and Emissions Reduction. I refer to the minister's previous answers and his statement that he has disclosed interests in accordance with the rules. Can the minister confirm that he has never disclosed his interest in an entity called JRAP to the parliament?
The minister has the call. Members on my left. The members on my left.
Mr Speaker, all my interests are declared in accordance with the rules.
The member for Canning.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is...
So the member for Hindmarsh is seeking to table a document.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I seek leave to table a media report in which the minister
for Hindmarsh will resume his seat.
That and should have.
Member for Hindmarsh will resume his seat. I've made it very clear I'm not even going to ask the Leader of the House for leave on publications that are widely available.
He obviously hasn't seen it.
Member for Canning.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Attorney-General. Will the Attorney update the House on how the Morrison government is on the side of Australians who quietly chose policies that strengthen our national security, essential to our safety? Is the Attorney aware of any other policies?
The Attorney-General has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member who obviously is the chair of the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security takes enormous interest into these matters. Now, since its return to Parliament, Mr Speaker, the Morrison government has clearly demonstrated that it is on the side of Australians who have made a quiet choice to strengthen our national security and to keep our nation safe. And I'd like to actually take this opportunity to congratulate those officers recently involved in the arrest of Junaid Thorne in New South Wales. No doubt that matter will proceed in the usual way. But it is very useful to remind members that what the Morrison government has done over the last 3 weeks is all directed at keeping Australians safe. In the first 3 weeks of Parliament, there have been 3 notable achievements. First, we have passed legislation for temporary exclusion order scheme to protect Australians from the threat of returning foreign fighters. The ability to be able to delay, to audit and control extreme high-risk individuals is absolutely critical to our future security, and it's instructive to note that we as a nation and as a government have learnt from past experience. Of the 25 Australians that travelled to Iraq to fight in that conflict and returned, 8 were ultimately convicted of terrorist offences. So this is utterly critical legislation for this country. Secondly, today we have introduced a bill that will ensure terrorists and their supporters are kept behind bars and improve the operation of the continuing detention order scheme for high-risk terrorist offenders, and we're doing that by extending the presumption against bail and parole to those who are not merely charged with terrorist offences but those who may be serving time for other offences but have clearly demonstrated terrorist sympathies. In addition, and thirdly, I might note that the Minister for Home Affairs this week has been in London. He has been working with our Five Eyes allies to ensure that technology companies help our police forces obtain access to encrypted services that shield the actions of child sex offenders. And why is that important? Well, one of the pieces of data that's become known through that Five Eyes process is that there has been a nearly 20-fold increase in industry referrals of child abuse material to the National Centre for Missing and Exploited Children between 2014 and 2018. That's an increase from 1 million referrals to 18 million referrals in that time. But lastly, and perhaps most positively, Mr Speaker, the best news for those who quietly choose the safety of themselves and their families this week is that the Leader of the Opposition, it appears finally, after 2 years of opposing this policy, now supports the measures to introduce mandatory minimum penalties for child sex offenders. This is a very long overdue change of position from the Australian Labor Party. But notwithstanding previous opposition recognition of the choices made by Australians at the last election chose for a very clear strength in these things. We will protect the safety. We welcome the change of position, I might say. We very much welcome the change of position.
The member for Hindmarsh.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is again to the Minister for Energy and Emissions Reduction. And I refer to the minister's previous answer and a report dated May 11th, which says, and I quote, he, Mr Taylor, acknowledged JRAT was not among the companies listed on his register of parliamentary interests, and goes on to say, and I quote from Mr Taylor, it should have been. Does the minister stand by his previous answer?
The minister has the call. The minister.
I do, Mr Speaker. All my interests are declared in accordance with the rules.
The member for Chisholm.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister representing the Minister for Women. Will the Minister outline to the House how the Morrison government is backing Australian women who choose to have more choices about how they live their lives?
The Minister for Women.
Thank you,
the Minister
Mr.
has
Speaker.
the call. Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for her question. Mr. Speaker, both Australian men and Australian women chose the Morrison government's positive plan for our future less than 11 weeks ago. And our government, and I understand that those opposite who have just laughed, are clearly having an issue coming to terms with the fact that they are not in government and that their plan was
The member for
rejected.
Gorton is now warned.
but our government has been working every single day to repay the trust that the Australian people have put in us and to back the choices that they made at the last election. Australian women chose aspiration and strong economic management over Labor's plan to take more of their money and to decide what's best for them. Mr Speaker, our government has always been about expanding choices for women and delivering more opportunities. We've already delivered a strong economy with over 1.4 million new jobs, and about 55% of those jobs were taken up by women. Women's full-time employment and female participation have reached record highs under our government, and we now have the lowest gender pay gap on record. Mr Speaker, earlier this year we delivered the 2019 Women's Economic Security Statement. It's a $151.4 million investment to improve the financial security and independence of Australian women. And it had some very practical assistance contained in that, such as the Future Female Entrepreneurs Program to help young women start their own businesses. Because we know that when you empower women financially, you empower the whole community. We're also pleased to be making the largest ever investment of $328 million in frontline services to reduce violence against women. And since our new childcare package was introduced last June, childcare costs have come down by 7.8% on average around the country. We're helping women save for retirement, and we're supporting women in rural and regional Australia. Now, I know that the Prime Minister is backed by some amazing women in his family, and he also has the backing and experience of a record number of women in Cabinet. And we have the outstanding female additions to the class of 2019. That's why Australian women can be certain that the Morrison government is on their side. We're supporting their choices, and we will continue to deliver for them and for all Australians.
The minister's time has concluded. It's all right. That was just—it was stale. Is it rather sudden? I think I was worried for your hamstring. I was. Hang on. I was just going to let you recover for a second. The member for Hindmarsh.
My question is again to the Minister for Energy and Emissions Reduction, and I refer to the minister's previous answer in relation to his disclosure. Why, in his latest statement of members' interests, did the minister disclose Guffey's interest in McLaughlin River Pastoral Company but not Jamland?
The Leader of the House.
Again,
members will cease interjecting. I've called the Leader of the House.
The second part of that question is clearly with respect to matters that are outside the minister's portfolio responsibilities. And again, it's an effort to link back a very, very straight answer, which is that the minister has disclosed his interests in accordance with the rules, to try and create a linkage into matters that are not inside his responsibility. And the minister's answers that he's disclosed in accordance with the rules is simply to state that he discloses trusts and nominee companies in exactly the same way that all the members opposite do, that everyone else over here does,
members
and indeed
on
the one that I'm looking at right now, which is not the minister's.
Yes, now, just a member for Isaacs. You know, my left ear is getting injured by you. Well, member for Bass, we're just going to deal with the point of order first. That's right. Well, I might take responsibility for seating arrangements if it continues. I'm going to hear from the Manager of Opposition Business, I have the problem I forecast the last time, with part of the question being clearly out of order. But I'll still hear from the Manager of Opposition Business in case he comes up with something miraculous.
Yeah. Speaker, on your previous ruling, where you have said that we are allowed to refer and question a statement that has been made in the House, what we've done here is this question refers very specifically to a statement that the minister has made repeatedly in the House concerning his disclosures, and then challenges it very specifically by referring to the exact disclosure he is referring to, where one company has been included and another company that the same Guffey has invested in is not mentioned.
I understand.
There is no other way for us to test a statement made in the House other than to put forward evidence that we don't believe it's true.
Well, I say to the Manager of Opposition Business, none of that overrides the standing orders or the minister's responsibility. Just be as patient as I am. What is the member for Bass? It's okay. I'm going to come there. That's right. And whilst you're referring to the previous answer, the second part of the question is referring to his responsibilities as a member of the House of Representatives, not as a minister, and the connection hasn't been made. Well, the Leader of the Opposition just interjected something. He interjected something that wasn't in the question, so it might give you a hint. No, I'm going to go to the next question. In deference to the Manager of Opposition Business.
Thanks, Speaker. The most important obligation of the obligations you refer to with ministers is to not mislead this House. We believe he has made a statement to this House that is not true, and that's what we want to test.
I'm going to say to the Manager of Opposition Business, I appreciate his efforts, but whoever's interjecting on my right's not helping. The member for Goldstein looks guilty, but no, wasn't. All right, I'm sorry. It was someone behind him. I'm just going to say to the Manager of Opposition Business, sorry, members on my right, I'm just going to say to the Manager of Opposition Business, with respect, the point of order he made then highlights my point, because that was not the question. The question wasn't whether he'd misled the House. That question wasn't asked. So that's why it asked about his individual responsibilities as a Member of Parliament. The member for Bass.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Energy and Emissions Reduction. Will the minister update the House on how the Morrison government is on the side of hard-working Australians who choose keeping the lights on and getting electricity prices down as their priorities?
The Minister for Energy. Member for McEwen. The minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Bass for her question, because I know she is passionate about a fair deal for energy for the people and businesses in her electorate of Bass. Just a few months ago, I spent time with her in Bass. She took me around a number of the small businesses in her electorate, talking about a fair deal for energy and the importance of affordable, reliable energy for small businesses, including George's Dry Cleaner, who we visited when I was there in Launceston. And as the member for the Bass, along with the member for Braddon, we've been working closely on ensuring that Tasmania can realise its full potential in providing energy to Tasmanians and to Australia through the Battery of the Nation project and the Marinus Link project. Now, Mr Speaker, at the last election, the Australian people chose a government focused on driving down power prices, because we know an extra $1 in the pockets of hard-working Australians will be well spent, Mr Speaker, will be well spent. At the last election, Australians chose a government taking action to lower prices from the 1st of July through the price caps we have established that is bringing down power prices, particularly for those not in a position to be able to negotiate with the big energy companies. They are seeing savings of up to $663 for households and over $2,000 for the sorts of small businesses I was talking about a moment ago. Now, Mr Speaker, at the last election, Australians chose to stop dodgy discounting and charges from big energy companies, including sneaky late payment fees, Mr Speaker, sneaky late payment fees, which were crippling those who could least afford them. And at the election, Australians chose a government that is establishing a retailer reliability obligation that ensures that the supply necessary to meet customers' needs is in place years ahead of time, Mr Speaker, years ahead of time. And we see this agenda is working, Mr Speaker, because just yesterday the ABS confirmed that power prices dropped 1.7% just in the last quarter alone, Mr Speaker. But on May 18, Australians did face a fork in the road, and they voted against Labor's reckless energy policy that they couldn't explain to the Australian people, where the costings weren't done, which was a tax on energy, electricity, gas and fuel, and a hit to jobs, wages and the economy, Mr Speaker. This government is clearly demonstrating it is on the side of the Australian people.
The member for Hindmarsh.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. I refer to my question is again to the Minister for Energy and Emissions Reduction, and I refer to the Minister's statement that all disclosures have been made in accordance with the rules. I also refer to the Minister's obligation under ministerial standards to disclose private interests to the Parliament and not to mislead this House. Why, in his latest statement of members' interest, did the Minister disclose Guffey's interests in McLaughlin River Pastoral Company but not Jamland?
The Leader of the House, on a point of order.
Mr Speaker,
member for Lyons. Do you want to walk, or do you want me to go through it? We've done it enough. Member for Lyons will leave under 94A. The member for Lyons will leave under 94A. Yeah. The Leader of the House.
So this time the member wedged in the words ministerial disclosure, but eventually asked a question which is the same question again about the member's disclosure as a member of parliament, which again is not inside his ministerial responsibility.
I'll hear from the Manager of Opposition Business.
Mr Speaker, to make plain what the question specifically referred to, it referred to the Statement of Ministerial Standards, which itself includes the statement all parliamentarians are required to disclose private interests to the parliament given the additional powers of ministers and assistant ministers. I expect them, these are the words of the Prime Minister, to provide me with additional information about their private interests to ensure there are no conflicts with their roles as ministers.
Yeah, I have to say, I'll hear from the Leader of the House again.
Question
no,
was why in his latest statement of members' interests, and then went on to add some information there. It was a statement about question about members' interests.
So I'll just make the point to the Leader of the House that I listened to the question closely. The substance of the question was about the ministerial code, and that was in the question. The substance of the question was about ministerial code, and I'm going to allow it. The Minister has the call. The Minister has the call.
Well, the answer is because I have declared my interests in accordance with the rules. Now, if Labor is proposing to change the rules, it would require many changes in disclosures, including from those opposite.
No, it's the member for Longman.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister outline how the Morrison government has demonstrated in this parliament that it is on the side of the Australian people? Have there been any alternative approaches on display?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Longman for his question and his outstanding maiden speech to this House and the incredible experience and life experience he brings to this place. And I would commend his speech to all members in this House, Mr Speaker. I was also asked about alternative approaches about how we are dealing with ourselves in this place. We used to have a Leader of the Opposition who used to agree with people that he didn't even know what they said. We now have a Leader of the Opposition who wants to vote for things in the Labor Party they don't even believe in, Mr Speaker. And we saw that on display. On this side of the House, since we've returned to the parliament, we have supported delivering tax cuts, tax relief for all working Australians so they can keep more of what they earn. The Labor Party had to be dragged kicking and screaming and finally voted for something they themselves said they don't believe in, Mr Speaker. It's very clear that the Liberal and National parties are for lower taxes and the Labor Party remains committed to higher taxes. The same was true when it came to supporting our farmers and graziers and those in rural and regional parts of the country when it came to the Drought Fund. On this side of the House, we put that forward after the Drought Summit last week. The Labor Party opposed it every step of the way to the election, and then we put this bill into the House, and once again the Labor Party had to be dragged kicking and screaming to support those in rural and regional Australia, and voted again for things they don't believe in, Mr Speaker. The same was true of protecting Australians against foreign terrorist fighters. 40 amendments the Labor Party said needed to be in place for that bill. None of them passed, and they still voted for it, voting again for things they don't believe in. And then when it comes to when we want to stop union militant thugs pushing their way around building sites around the country and making sure that workers' entitlement funds in the hundreds of millions are not siphoned off to the gravy train of union excess, Mr Speaker, that's when they show up. That's when they say, oh, that's when they're going to vote for what they believe in, Mr Speaker. They'll sell the rest out. Now they'll get another opportunity when we come back. The Workers' Entitlement Fund bill will come back into this place and we'll see whose side they're on. I'll tell you another bill that's going to come back into this place, and that's drug testing, Mr Speaker, to ensure that our welfare system has integrity and that we support Australians who are trying to get off welfare and into work. Just like with a cashless debit card, we will see when it comes to these issues, Labor is not for taxpayers, nor are they for people who want to get off welfare and get to work. The member for Longman knows this, that if you have a go, you get a go in this country, and the member for Longman knows this, that you don't have to hold people back to let others go forward. The member for Longman knows that we will never engage Labor's politics of envy. The Australian people chose the economics of aspiration. And on that note, I ask that further questions be put on the notice later.
I thank the Prime Minister. If members could remain in their seats, we have some business that all members will be interested in. Question time's now over. Okay, that's it. It's done.